Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Raptors Weekly Podcast. This is, I guess, the first episode of the off-season, technically, where, I don't know, we'll try and figure out how to cover the Raptors in an interesting lens as they navigate what's going to be probably a very active off-season that has big decisions ahead of them. To help me talk about it, Michael Grange of Sportsnet, who is a seminal figure in covering the Raptors, has been there since their first game, is there now. Mike, how the hell are you?
I'm good, Samson. Appreciate you having me on, and let's see if we can make any sense of what's happened and what might happen. How's that?
I got a really great statistic for you. So,
Okay.
if the Raptors shot from the free throw line in that Bulls game, your career average at Mount Allison, they would have won the game by 1 point.
That's all it takes. So
Yeah,
yeah, so they shot what, 55%? If they made two more free throws, whatever, four
yeah,
more.
something like that. So, the first thing I want to ask you actually is kind of the Nick Nurse stuff, since that's a lot of what's kind of been hanging around. I've had opinions on him, mostly relaying to, is the defensive structure sustainable? Is there enough going on offensively? He's kind of hands off in some regard. And then there's been, like, I guess, interpersonal stuff is how he talks about players in media relative to other coaches. But what has been because you've covered him his full time there, what's your stance on Nurse over the time and his relationship with the team now?
First of all, I think he's been a really good coach, right? I don't think makes me much of a. I don't think it's all that far out of an
Yeah.
opinion, and I think the things that he's done well are pretty well documented. And it's interesting if you look at the 5 years, how he's kind of had to adjust and change. And I think he's done that pretty successfully. If you look at the team that won, that's clearly like very dramatically different than the team he's had the last couple of years. And, but not just in talent, right? But very much in style, right?
Mm-hmm.
And with the team that won, especially, you were toggling between completely different identities depending on the availability of Kawhi, and then you had, the arrival of Gasol, and that kind of ushered in a whole new range of possibilities. And I think he navigated that incredibly well, especially given the scrutiny and pressure. Right, like he was. I'm not sure if he was or was not their first choice as head coach, but he was an unknown commodity at the NBA level, and he nailed it. And then obviously we all know the next year, if anything, I thought his identity came through even more. And I would say his identity was maybe first introduced with the bench mob in 17, 18. Like that, he had his fingerprints all over that group. And you saw that come to, I think, its fullest expression in the 1920 season. So that's all obviously great stuff. But I think he's gone as coaches can do. Like, I think he's got a lot more conservative in some ways in how he's used his roster the last couple of years, especially. I think I think you get full marks for just trying to grind out wins any way you can. I mean, that is the job. But I think there's been a lot of short-term valuation regarding players that's kind of come up and hurt them in the last couple of years. I mean, we're probably going to talk about the Raptors bench, and for good reason. It's, just has not been productive at all this season. And you could make the case, well, because they're not very good, right? Like, I mean, you can go through each player and go, well, where would he fit in another rotation? But, when you look at it, and I touched on that history with the bench mob going back when he's still Dwayne's assistant, that group had a great runway. They had consistent cohesion within themselves. They had great, consistent playing time, even within the context of a very good team. And the results are still paying off, right? Like all those guys, we can list them, like incredible. But is it chicken or egg, right? So when you look at how little they've got out of their bench this season and last, well, you could say, well, every time we play X, Y, or Z, it hurts us. But, I wonder what would have happened if they said, we're going to go with X, Y, and Z. We're going to roll out these minutes, and we're going to take our lumps and hopefully grow. And maybe had they done that, you'd have a more viable solution in your rotation. You'd also have more valuable assets within your roster. And, maybe this season's tune would be a little bit different. So I think that's been a weakness. And in terms of the way he's kind of called out players and not called out players, I'm very comfortable. I think it's fine. You're in the NBA. You got a lot of scrutiny. If you're used to it, you should be able to handle it. If you can't, maybe find another line of work. But within the context of most things, or almost whenever possible, what's said publicly has been addressed privately. And if I guess there's a time and place to kind of use the media some magical way. I don't know exactly what it is. But if it's kind of a habit that guys are kind of hearing about their shortcomings, not directly from you in the first place, I don't think that's a great trait. I don't think it bodes, I just don't think it's good, right? Like, I mean, what's to stop them from starting to tell the public their concerns about you, right? Like it's just a bad way to do business. Again, so I'm not advocating for coaches just to never say anything bad about their players, but it should be, most of the time it should start with, we had a conversation about this and it's a big problem and we've got to, we're going to continue trying to address it. Okay. Right. But when it's, Chris Boucher's like, no, you hear that over and over again where guys roll in the rotation would change or move or whatever it might be. And you'd ask them and the answer was typically no, I just got to the gym and found out or whatever it might be. So I don't think that's great. And then, to the kind of biggest question, which is how much, I think, is you're asking, is how much is how he's kind of adhered to a certain way of style of play, how much has it helped them or cost them? I kind of give Nick credit for it. I actually do see it mostly as a positive. He's been pretty transparent, certainly in the last couple of years, and this year particularly, about how they want to play, what their goals are. And, that line, key performance indicators, right? Like, I mean, they've check, right? Like, writ large, they've won the possession battle like no team in the league this year. And no team did last year. So if you're a head coach and this is what you're presenting as the way we're going to play basketball in this league, and you keep nailing all those measuring sticks, I think you deserve credit for that. The bigger question is, once it's shown that it's, what we don't know is, had you kind of said, we're going to change course with this group, with this roster, what it would look like. And, so it begs the question, maybe he should have tried something. I think if I don't think that would have worked either personally. But so big picture, I think, he's shown a lot. I think he's shown some strain the last couple of years. I think he's been way too conservative on how he's used a second unit or developed one. But I don't think we can sit here and bash him for delivering a style of play that, he set out to deliver. And by the way, we've seen even in the playoffs so far has, can really work if you can shoot a little bit.
I think, the disconnect has typically been that the Raptors seem to be kind of artificially or jerry-rigging their way to the possession differential. When they were looking at the statistics, what was it that it was like 80% of teams that win the possession differential by 5 or more win the game. And so those teams won the possession differential, but they did it playing a different style that didn't kind of fetishize it. It was a byproduct. And the Raptors were like, we want that as the product. And they left behind.
Let's miss as many shots as we can.
Yeah, exactly.
That's got to be good. Think of all the offensive rebounds.
Yeah.
But you got to give them credit. I think, they do force the turnovers. They do, partly because they don't pass. They do take care of the ball. They don't turn over. So I give them credit for that. And, but, the flip side of that is I talked to assistant coaches at various points in the year and they'd say, look, there is no plan defensively. These are opposing assistant coaches. It's like, as long as you can beat that first pressure, whatever shape or form it comes in, you're 4-on-3 and maybe better,
Yeah.
right? And that's shown in the opposing field goal numbers, right? Um, so that's maybe where you have to wonder if there's some attention to detail not taken care of, and obviously that's why they went and got Pirtle, etc.
And then, well, after
But
getting Pirtle,
fetishizing is a good word. It's like it's kind of like in hockey when Corsi was introduced, right? Puck possession became a really big thing, and you'd have players like kind of gimmicking the way you play to sort of pump up some of these analytics,
mhm.
so they'd have a better case of contract time, like they dump the puck in at certain times, whatever. So there's a little bit. I don't think the Raptors are doing it that much because I think they miss shots quite honestly. But yeah, I see what it's not a bad way of putting it.
Another one is third baseman plays closer to the line so that he takes away the extra base hits for his WAR, but you let more singles go through like the hole or whatever. There's always a way to game it, but that is the interesting part is that the Raptors probably Nick Nurse, as you said, there's conservative aspects to it. There's a lack of developing the bench, but as far as getting the most out of what is, I think, a very limited roster, the way they played certainly worked last year. The amount of minutes they played, as far as like hacking net rating, it's almost the same thing as missing shots for possession differential. You play your best players more minutes, you win more minutes, you win more games. Pascal Siakam and Fred VanVleet probably bore the brunt of that physically more than most players would. Really high ranking in miles traveled, in minutes played, and for Pascal, isolations, closeouts, the whole deal. But the limited roster. They have a guy coming off the bench, sixth man, who is going to try and probably get like $25 million a year. They have Precious Achua, who, man, last year shooting 44% on catch and shoot threes after the All Star break was kind of, a defender you could throw out against a bunch of different players and had success against superstars. They have, and Chris Boucher is, I think, objectively a good bench player in the NBA. That's at least 8 deep. And yet they lose the 9-10. I kind of want to talk about with free agency looming, the fact that the Raptors are supposed to have a good roster. You go look at each player and say, these guys are good. Why are they underperforming? What do you think this team should look like after, free agency is over? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, because I kind of agree. I think you do go through their top 7 or 8 guys and go, yeah, that guy's got this, that. Um, but if we're just talking roster construction, here's a little stat for you. Probably not quite as in depth as some of yours, but the Milwaukee Bucks. Now it's always not fair to compare your team to the best team, arguably in the league. But the Bucks, I think they have 13 players on their roster averaging at least one made three a game, or maybe it's 12,
Mm-hmm.
right? And of those 12, 10 of them are shooting league average or better. The 2 guys who aren't are Pat Connaughton, who shot 40% last year, and Chris Middleton, who's 39% for his career. The Raptors have how many guys have average one made three this year?
Maybe 4.
Yeah, exactly 4. And of those, how many of them are better than league average from 3?
1.
2. So
Gary
is
and
just
OG.
above league average.
Right.
And OGU's had a pretty good
year. What is league average this year?
Yeah, 36 on the nose, I think.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, Gary hit 36.9. Yeah.
So, yeah, barely.
Yeah.
That's oversimplifying it, but the same story, when I was in Boston at the end of the season there, it was the same story. I mean, Boston had 3 guys in their top 6 out each game, and they still had multiple lineups with a minimum 3 real 3-point shooters on the team. Now those are championship teams. They're built up. They're loaded. They're going for it. But I mean, that's, to me, and you wrote about this, I thought, really well earlier this week. I mean, that's the story of this team is you can't shoot. and like everything you do tactically is to try and disguise the fact that you can't shoot or compromise for it, or compensate for it. And, and so to ask your question going into free agency or in terms of next steps of roster building, if they don't address that, I don't see really how anything changes. I mean,
can I ask you then if we're because I joined the beat this year. Basically, I got to hear things a couple years just being in the sphere, a little bit more this season. But as far as covering the Raptors over this time, seeing that active bet on we can develop shooting, and the fact that not only did the league change in kind of devaluing set shooters because a bunch of teams got really good at running guys off the line, motion shooters at 37% became way more important than a set shooter at 41%, for example. But what did you make of the Raptors' bet on shooting, kind of looking back on that, being able to develop it?
Well, they're not the only team that's tried it, right? That was a big part of the process with the Sixers. I think to an extent, Oklahoma City's doing it this year, or is in the process of doing that. Even going back when shooting wasn't as high value, those old Bucks teams, not the old Bucks teams, but the Larry Sanders era Bucks, where they were, to me, the first team that really made kind of length to be a primary defensive weapon across their lineup. That was part of their thing too. And I'm not sure it's really worked all that well. Like, I think there's some individual success stories. There always are. But in terms of turning a team of average to non-shooting prospects to a team of average to better than average shooting prospects, I can't think of many examples. And, so I would think it's kind of an ill-advised bet, like in retrospect. OG Anunoby, he's probably the primary example of a guy who's really developed into a legitimate, top 25 shooter. And Norm would be the other guy.
Mm-hmm.
But, you're always a little cautious as to how much of that is through the team or through the individual. And, Norm in particular, that guy was just an incredible grinder. And I would watch his pregame shooting workouts. And I remember very clearly, probably maybe his second year in the league. And, I think I watched him. It was one of the best shooting workouts I've ever seen. And just telling him, man, that was awesome. Like, I was like, just as a fan almost, that was incredible to watch. And sure enough, he's probably a top 15 or 20 shooter in the league right now and has been for a few years. So, but outside of that, it's pretty slim, right? And they've invested in the analytics side with the Noah stuff. And in theory, Nick's himself is, a bit of a guru in the area. And, but, it's not something that seems to be easy to develop. And I think I would also point out that it's probably not a coincidence that the Bucks have such a high team shooting percentage when you consider, you got four guys running at Giannis most possessions. So you're getting a lot of, pretty good looks. And I don't think in the Raptors case, how many cases is the defense collapsing, sprinting out to a guy with his his feet set, just waiting wide open. It's not like a big, you don't have to sell out defensively against Toronto, I don't think, as much as you do against other teams. And that affects the quality of shots you're getting.
It's kind of interesting thinking about what are the shooters being able to kind of prep themselves for a shot. And it's probably easier for, that top side action that the Bucks get a lot of, Giannis collapses the defense, goes out to the corner, shoots up above the break, goes out to either above the break on the other side or to the other corner. And they can have, there's a lot of preparation in knowing the ball is coming your way. But a lot of the Raptors' open 3-point shots are off of doubles and one pass away. And you're kind of trying to navigate that space as a cutter or a shooter that is not as easy to kind of prep for it. And I think, the Raptors are missing out on a lot of rhythm threes, which helps bump up mediocre shooters into average shooters into good shooters. And I think that's something they're missing on in big time. And
no,
also
I agree.
just shooting talent too.
I think you're dead on. And to that point, how do you get them? You get to get the defense in rotation somehow, some way. I mean, what's interesting is, we heard Nick talk about this, their expected points per shot, right? This XPPP, this mythical number that's out there, right? And, it's great. Our XPPP is great. I'm like, okay, I guess, but I mean, if it keeps finding Scottie in the corner and he's a below average, catch and shoot 3-point shooter.
28%. Yeah.
Yeah, overall, and not and like and again, those numbers are consistent with wide open catch and shoots as well, right? Like
Yeah.
it's his whole package. Um, well, they probably have a high XPP because people aren't closing out. So like, why bother? Like that's a good shot for us. If you're going to take that, that's good for us. We'd much
Hmm.
rather have Scottie do that than shoulders downhill at speed with power into our defense. So I mean, I think I do think it is a roster issue overall, and not one that's happened overnight either.
So this is kind of something that everybody's talked about, is that the glut of wings who are really good defensively. Well, Pascal had like a really down part of the season. OG, not so
Pascal is
much.
conceivably really good defensively.
Yeah, he can like ratchet it up. Scotty has had nice week, like a week at a time, where the closeout footwork is pretty good. Like he uses his length, and it's just not at the level. Nobody's at the level of OG, obviously, but this all kind of becomes tenable if somebody outside of OG is shooting the ball well. And Pascal, he'll be 30 by the time the next season starts. I think he'll be looking for a new contract. Scotty, I don't
I
think
think
there's.
Pascal just turned 29.
Okay, so
Or
yeah,
he's soon to turn 29, so he'll
right,
be
right, right,
by
right.
30. Yeah.
Yeah, so if we're talking about developmental curves, Pascal, as much as he preaches the work and everybody sees the work, at some point that turns from development into maintenance for players. Who knows when that comes for Pascal? But as far as expecting the shooting on the roster to improve, it's probably not likely. I don't know how comfortable you are trying to, step outside of this and do like the team building, but if you had like you could put together a dream situation for the Raptors, what way do they operate going forward? What types of players are they bringing in?
Yeah, I mean, I've said this lots of times. I think that they need to be in a situation where they're building their base of players and or draft picks. Like, I don't think they have enough. I don't think they have nearly enough. The simplest, someone asked this, I was on radio last week or something, and I know this stuff is hard to quantify. I was like, no, it's not hard to quantify. You don't have enough players. You don't have enough good players. That's as simple as I can put it. And I don't see an obvious path for them to get more good players, absent, turning one of their very good players into, a couple of really good players and maybe a pick or two. And maybe you might have to repeat that process so that all of a sudden you're sitting on, maybe you don't have quite the high end, but you have a broader depth and you've got some prospect in your your prospect pool's deeper and richer. You maybe have a couple of additional picks, and we've all seen that work, right? Like that was the formula worked up to 17, 18. And then when the time came, you had that team could have done anything. They could have stayed put and won 60 games again, and maybe had better luck in the playoffs. They chose to make two huge trades, and still, as a result of those trades, had plenty of depth and versatility in the roster to win. Not to mention adding the best player in the game at the time. Um, so that's what I would do. I would take like one of your key guys, and just based on where they're all at contractually, it's either OG and Pascal, and based on their ages, it kind of comes down to Pascal, right? And I'm not trying to run him out of town. I mean, he's been an incredible story, and I could talk all day about what things to an organization should relish about Pascal Siakam. But in the hard business of basketball, that's kind of would be to me a bit of a shortcut to kind of regaining some equilibrium in your roster, regaining some some flexibility within your overall pool of talent, be it draft picks or players, and then just accept that it's from there. It's going to be probably another couple of steps, and that's sort of what I would do. And obviously within that, you'd want to prioritize acquiring some guys who could shoot. You know what I mean? Like, and ideally, A huge upgrade at two guard. No defense, no disrespect to Gary Trent Jr., but he can't be your starter. So you want a guy who's super athletic there, who can really shoot it, who has upside. Um, you'd want to find a really, really good backup point guard who can, Delon Wright. Not that it has to be him, but a version of him, a guy who can start for you and do well, a guy who can play along your starter and do well.
Andrew Nembhard, somebody like that.
Sure, yeah, like let's keep dreaming. But like that kind of stuff, and what would you lose in doing that? You'd lose, a 25 point a game scorer who's been all NBA, all star. But I don't think you're, again, and barring some real luck this year in the draft, either by moving up and getting a great pick or getting a great pick at wherever they end up picking. I'm not sure what other wiggle room you have.
So they're basically luxury tax. Well, they're guaranteed luxury tax. They bring everybody back. I don't care how good the negotiations go.
Right.
They're in the luxury tax. Pascal, I think, just to couch what you were saying, there's a way that it seemed like it was viable in the past that if Scottie made the leap early, if Fred was shooting fantastic and still really sticky at the point of attack, if OG's creation, if everybody took that little bit of step, then it made sense to keep your all NBA player on the roster. But if the Raptors ceiling is no longer very high, and as you kind of laid out, like there's not really a conceivable way to improve the back end of the roster, and the top end of the roster isn't so much of world beaters that it makes the back end irrelevant. Kind of like the Suns, right? Like the
Right.
Suns will still they'll be in it. Their bench is not very good, but they'll be in it. Pascal is just because of the way the contracts line up. OG, the team that wanted to trade for him at the deadline, they already lost a playoff run that they would have got with him. Fred isn't, whether he signs, whether he takes the option or not, whatever, but probably not on contract. Gary, not on contract. Jakob, not on contract. It's like it points one way, and it's once again the Raptors, not from a position of strength the same way they were in 2017-18, but their hand is being forced a little bit here. I'm curious, do you like Jakob Pertl as the center next to Scottie Barnes? This is something people talk about just because of the lack of shooting. But what do you like about their dynamic, and what do you think needs to improve?
Um, like obviously the hesitation, and neither of them can really shoot. So they're
Mhm.
kind of, and it's funny not to always live in the past, but a big reason they had to move away from DeMar DeRozan, there was more than one, but a really big one was him and Jonas Valanciunas breathed the same air, right? They needed to be in the same places, roughly the same time. It made it very complicated in the guts of big games or the guts of any game because they were both trying to be in that 16-foot radius. In JV's case, to either roll and finish, or in DeMar's to either pull up or get to the rim. So those conditions exist again, right? They're just different kinds of players. I think all that said, JV and DeMar were part of a pretty good team,
Mhm.
pretty effective. So there is a way you can do it. And I think, Jakob is, super high IQ, super expert at kind of minimizing, the impact of his lack of spacing. And I think, Scottie has just, he's just such a horse, he can kind of overcome some of that too. So, I think those guys can work together for a lot of good reasons, but around them, you just need so much. You
Yeah.
need three shooters, like three really good. And I guess you'd have OG in theory. You might have Fred, and then whoever that next person would have to be. Like they couldn't be, And again, that speaks to why Pascal and Scottie and OG Pascal, Scottie, and Jakob are kind of. It's a little crowded in there.
I asked Nick about that, the limitations, and he had said that, like, well, they're better shooters than I had thought, and I didn't think that was necessarily true, but I thought that it was what I wanted to hear was what he thought the passing could do to unlock things. And the Raptors, with Jakob and OG in particular, They ran like Horns flex, the flex screen for OG to come open off of Fred, and then they ran it out of the elbow alignment if teams were cheating it. And like that's just good coaching. That's like a great setup. But I wonder how much easier it gets if they do have like if Scottie moves to the 4 and they have at the 3 and the 2 and the 1, just like
Yeah, I mean, there's potential there, but then also like, then you're turning Scotty into a guy who lives in the dunker spot, right? Like, and he's good at that. He can do it, but like, is that how you're elevating and getting the most out of what we all still believe, or they certainly hope, is a really, really special talent? That's another factor that goes into all of this is at some point, Scotty's got to put up or shut up, right? Like it's got to be like this guy is a guy who can lift your whole team, and and the way to find that out is you probably got to give it to him in a way, and and then so yeah, so I think it's just complicated with the three of them. I thought Pascal and Jakob did some good stuff together too, right? Like I mean, there's if anything, they maybe are a smoother fit as a pick and roll tandem. I don't think Pascal's quite as good a passer, but he's pretty good. But he's got the stronger mid range, so there's a little more pull up action to be had there. But then what do you do with Scottie, right? So I just think it's just a little bit awkward unless if your fifth starter was some version of Joe Harris pre-ankle injury, that's probably fine. It would probably work out okay.
Before we kind of just talk about basketball in general, I have a few questions about the Canadian basketball, the league at large. For whatever team it looks like the Raptors have, do you think Nick Nurse will be the one coaching it next season?
I kind of go back and forth every day. There was a point I would have said, no, it's done. He's gone. I think there's a couple of complicating, this is again something I discussed on the radio, is there's a couple of complicating factors here. And, one of them is, the Raptors aren't going to fire Nick. I don't think. They're not in the business of swallowing $9 million and hoping he finds another job to offset that. It's not like they wouldn't do it, but I'd be very surprised if that's what they do. So a little bit this is dependent on, and I think was driven by Nick kind of, trying to find his next best landing spot, right? Like, and you and I can sit here, and we have sat here and said, what's the trajectory of the Raptors in the next 3 to 4 years? Like, there's some possibility, I guess, that they hit it and they kind of become everyone's darling again, but it's less likely than the other scenario. And so if you're looking at your coaching prime, you want to attach yourself to something that's got some upside that you can win either now or soon. And, so I think that was real. I think that's part of what was happening here. And I think probably also real is, when you got a guy going into last year's deal, you've got a team that's got to start, you can't be caught flat footed. Like you have to understand what the marketplace is and who your next options might be. So I think that explains a lot of the noise that we've heard the last month or so.
He's also more entrepreneurial than most.
He is. That's a good He is entrepreneurial. Nick's like, he's not shy, right? Like he's not sitting, I hope the Lakers job would come open because maybe they think of me. He's like, let's make that job come open. And, you know what I mean? Like he's aggressive. Again, not reporting that, just but this is the scenario. The other scenario, right, is these jobs don't come open as, in the kind of order that serves Nick's purposes, in the timing that serves the Raptors' purposes. And they both could end up kind of going, well, you need me and I need you. So let's try and figure this out. And, I don't think that's impossible. It would probably require some sort of, check to be written from MLSE, maybe not a 5-year, $50 million extension, like I'm sure Nick would hope to get at his next job. But, maybe some compromises available in there. Again, just speculating. Because, I don't think, Nick wants, I don't think the Raptors want to fire Nick, and I don't think Nick wants to quit. I think we can guarantee that. Like there's a little bit too much incentive on each side. So, So I think it's going to have to be something where, um, Nick's next step is quite evident, and it kind of happens a little bit smoothly, and then the Raptors can kind of move on to their plan B, whatever it might be.
Do you think that's why the front office hasn't really spoken much since the season ended? Like they're dealing
Uh,
with this kind of stuff?
a little bit of that. Like I think it'd be awkward for them to come out today, and we'd all sit there, and all we'd want to talk about was Nick, and all they could say is we don't know. So I think that they have a lot of stuff to figure out. They really do. It's obvious to us, and so I think for them, they're best served by taking the time necessary to really understand what is in front of them and what their options are, and why do that to serve our purposes. Why. So I presume it. I don't think we'll hear from them this week. I wouldn't be shocked at all if it wasn't even if it wasn't next week either. I think there's a lot of what was Nick's timeline back in Philly? Going to take a couple of weeks after the season, so they're in reflecting. Everyone's reflecting right now.
Right. So the other thing I want to talk to you about is you and I have sat and we've shared some press rooms this year, asked coaches about the changing league, changing play styles, changing personalities, and just from somebody who you've played competitive basketball, you've covered the Raptors for some time now. You've covered other teams, you've been all over the sport. What is the number one change you've seen from the time you started covering it to now?
Like in basketball terms?
In basketball terms, yeah.
Player skill. Player skill. Like it's unbelievable, right? And the that whole science, if you want to call it that, to creating advantages off the dribble is something that was, I remember, Baron Davis, right, or Tim Hardaway, and you look at their crossovers and how devastating they were and how kind of wow, and Iverson, of course. But that's standard operating procedure now, right? If you're a high skill ball handler, doesn't matter size, you've got not just those moves, but like counters to those moves and sequencing of those moves. And then that is, of course, is introduced with, a packaging of passing options that, any really, really good player can kind of tap into based on whatever situation they're in on the floor. And of course, the whole shooting element is, as pervasive as that is, and the range of the shooting. So, those things that we kind of take for granted now are standard, for an NBA player. And then you might not have it all coming out of college, or whatever stream you're coming from, although more and more do. Shaden Sharp is a pretty good example, right? Like there's a guy who didn't play college, barely played high school. And after spending 50 games standing in a corner, except when he could, someone could send him for a break and a dunk, all of a sudden he looks like he's been in the league 12 years, right? Like I'm not talking about all the decisions he may or may not be making, his defensive acumen, all these other elements, but in terms of his skill, right? And Anthony Simons would be another one, and like it's on and on and on, and we get the chance to see that pregame. We get a glimpse into how much deliberate effort is put into building those skills and then applying them in kind of game sequences, and that wasn't happening 20 years ago.
Do you think that level of skill is ultimately what's led to the parity of the NBA now?
That's a good point. I was kind of thinking about that recently. Like, forever, if you had, your top 5 or 8 or 9 player in the league, and maybe 2 of those guys, you're winning. Like it just, there wasn't. But now, I'm not sure that. I'm like obviously the gap between Kevin Durant and humans is
more guys can break a game open.
But yeah, absolutely. But what was the number? I think I heard the Pelicans, I think they had four guys who scored 35 points, four guys who scored 40 points this year, and eight or nine guys who scored 30,
Yeah.
like in winning games, in
Yeah.
games that they won. Like that's pretty crazy, right? And you look at that roster, and you're not going, Brandon Ingram, okay, Zion, yeah. After that, it's a lot of pretty good players, and yet, they're a lot of them have the ability to, you know, eat your lunch on a given night. So I think I do think that that's a factor, and it's going to be interesting to trace as it gets a little harder to either build or maintain these super high end rosters. If maybe we are headed for real parity in the league, which is I haven't seen almost in you know like almost my whole career.
Yeah. It's really interesting, right? Because it's if you give Jalen Noel, for example. Now, I'm not saying Jalen Noel has the same career arc as RJ Barrett, but if you give them the same, and he's certainly not as good defensively for spurts and stretches, but if you give Jalen Noel the same usage as RJ Barrett, I think you're probably coming close to the same production offensively, and the salaries between that is just like astronomical.
No, that's no, I that's a strong point, right? Is how much value are you getting per dollar past a certain point, right? And it's diminishing, and I think so I do, and I think the other factor is the guys who maybe aren't quite as capable of adding this super high end skill. They're getting drafted and turning into the very rare humans who can kind of screw that skill up, right? So you're Jaden McDaniels or these incredibly rangy Herb Jones, right? Like these
Yeah.
super rangy, tough, difficult guys who have like a little bit of kryptonite they can kind of lob into the equation, right? So so yeah, I think it'd be interesting to see if the parity we've seen this year becomes more of it, especially as what we would define as the most elite guys in this league age out, right? Like, I mean, we're
Yeah.
heading for that. And, so is Shea, who's probably, I think, the best of the young guys,
He's
the
I
under
could see him.
25s.
I've been big on Shea forever. I think he could win an MVP. There's nobody like him in the history of the league. He's just
So, I mean, like I would say he's probably the number one or two trade asset in the league, right? Based on
yeah.
his age, contract, production, everything.
Raptors should do that, sure.
Yeah, take the franchise, we'll take Shea. Um, but the point I'm kind of getting to is, will in his career being Shea enough to win a title?
Oh
Right,
no.
being Shea plus some guys be enough? It might not be. It might be being Shea plus a bunch of guys plus good health plus a lot of luck. You might get one. But the idea that the best player in the league is going to wrap up 4 or 5, 6 titles in his prime, we might not see that.
I do wonder if because there's rings culture everybody talks about, right? And in baseball, it's less about that. It's more so it's like we have to keep the window open. If the run happens, it happens, but we have to put ourselves in a position to repeatedly make an attempt at that run. And basketball is just not like that. It's like you win or you lost, you loser. Like it's pretty harsh terms for those top end guys. I wonder if people are just going to be more about like windows, and especially you look at like the Warriors are having a lot of trouble with the Kings. The Raptors, the way the Raptors were made specifically in a lab to defend dribble handoff actions and make them more difficult and push teams into the backcourt
OG
of the shot
versus
clock.
Demontis Sabonis was not a good matchup for
Exactly.
Demontis Sabonis.
And the Raptors are not this year just not a good team. And the defending champs are like, how the hell do we defend these actions when we're playing like instead of Pascal and OG and Scottie and these guys who are, well equipped to defend that specific action, we have like Jordan Poole and Steph Curry. And on the other side, we were talking about really great two guards that the Raptors maybe should have gone after. Malik Monk, oh my days. Like there's just the talent is burgeoning everywhere. I wonder if it switches from the weak link, because that's kind of what it was. It's like your weakest link on the floor. To it's like, what's your strongest link? That's what I
Yeah.
wonder.
Yeah, no, and I think we are. I think we have a little bit, and we are moving off of. You know, he didn't win a ring because it was always a stupid argument because there's guys who played their whole career where only Michael Jordan won a ring, right?
Yeah.
And so okay, does that mean Karl Malone wasn't good? And so now you're in an environment. I guess it could go the other way, right? If all of a sudden there's 10 teams in a given year who might think about winning a ring, and you can't get your one in that situation, well, maybe I don't know, maybe it does hurt your cause. I don't know, but I mean, I think overall, like I think we're speaking the same language. I think there's a lot of really good players, and hence I think more competitive teams.
I think the last thing I want to talk about, provided you have the time, is
Sure.
Jonathan Chen, who I know you've read some of his work. Team Canada Basketball, Oren also does really great work, but you've been covering Canada basketball for a long time now, and you're very familiar with the players, the coaches, the grassroots aspect of it. I kind of want to just introduce everybody listening to your thoughts on Canada's order of operations over the next little while. What you think about, the team headed into, I
Yeah.
guess, the Olympics soon.
Well, if they can't get the Olympics from the platform they'll have this summer, I don't know, right? Because forever, coming out of the Americas was tough, right? You had Brazil was at times very, very good. Argentina was for years they were very, very good. Of course, the United States. So and then there's a Puerto Rico or Mexico would pop up and they'd be tough too. Those circumstances don't really exist, right? It's the United States who, by the way, are more vulnerable than we've known them to be, and that's it. Like, not to say these other teams aren't capable or all that stuff, but there's no next power in the Americas. It's Canada, and so the reason that's important for people who may or may not know is at the FIBA World Cup. You have to finish. There's 7 teams from the Americas qualified, and you have to finish among the top 2 of those 7 teams to automatically qualify for the Olympics. So if you concede that USA is one of them, Canada would have to be first of the next 6. And again, based on the competition, Canada should be. Like, there's no like maybe or let's hope. They really should be. And so I think, the next question, of course, who's going to play, how are you going to use them? But I wouldn't. Let's just pretend that Jamal Murray doesn't play, because I'll be surprised if he does, just based on his injury and what I think will probably be a pretty long playoff run, or long enough that he could use it as a reason. Shea and Lou have already said they're going to play. We've seen Nikhil out. Nikhil, again, a guy who's, I think, is done being slept on. Like, I think he's got a chance to be really good. I think he's really good in the format that Canada uses him. So that's 3. You should get RJ, I think, and we'll see how they use him. And then after that, it's they're a little thin up front. It's Kelly Olynyk and Dwight Powell, and it's funny, like Chris Boucher, I think, would be a really interesting player for Canada, but it's never quite come together, and it's I've heard varying issues, right? Sometimes it's been Chris hasn't been treated, like hasn't been kind of approached the right way, and other times it's like haven't been. I don't know if the connection's been made with Chris the right way. I don't know. I can't say for sure. But the last, I think he was thinking about it last year, and it was his contract year. This year he says he'd be open to playing. Yeah. I presume he'll get asked. But long-winded saying, like, I think it's a team that, they have closers and they have depth, and those 2 things. And you have, in Shea, I think, a guy who could probably go to that tournament, maybe be the best player there, outside of Jokic, maybe, if Jokic plays. Sorry, I can't remember if Serbia's in or not. So I should Google that. But regardless, like, he'll be, I think he's got a good possibility of being the best guard, best ball handler, best in the whole tournament. And so if that's your guy and you have enough support around them, pretty good coaching, then like I think they gotta qualify. They gotta be in Paris next year.
Yeah. Is there anybody that you think, because as you talked about, the front court is a little bit slept on, but as far as the guys who have helped move Canada basketball closer to their goals despite not being NBA talent, is there anybody who a listener would appreciate hearing about, do you think?
Like every single guy who played in these windows, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting too. Like they, wow. I mean, I'm a big Phil Scrubb fan. Like I think he's a really good player, and he's made a really good career in Europe. He's a combo guard, can guard probably three positions, doesn't say boo, and can make threes. So you might want to have a guy like that around. Yeah. So the other guy I think who played was very active in the qualifying windows, who I think they'd be remiss not to find a spot for, would be Cassius Robertson. He's just. I've asked, could he be an NBA player, and he kind of falls in that Brady Heslip category. I think he's better than Brady Heslip, like in terms of what he can do with the ball in his hand and kind of create, maybe play a little point here and there. But probably just not quite robust enough defensively to last in the NBA. But he's legitimately probably one of the top 50 shooters in the world. Like, I think through all stages of qualifying, he shot better than 50, like literally, I think 54 to 56% from three. Gets it off quickly, can get it off with a bounce, off the run. And so when you're playing with like so many guys, you're going to have so much gravity. If he's the guy on the other side of the floor, like you got to have him. You mentioned Kyle Wiltshire. That's an interesting one. He hasn't had much presence around the program because he's been in China, and may still, but I know for sure very recently was subject to their COVID restrictions. And so he couldn't just, it was like 2 week quarantine coming and going. And, it just wasn't practical for him to participate. But again, like he's like a 6'10" version of Cassius Robertson, like just an incredible shooter who can, in his own way, punish a mismatch because he's got that goofy little post game. So, there's three guys I think. I would also mention Tommy Scrubb too. So there's four guys who all kind of, one a pure specialist in cash, and then all four pretty elite shooters. I'd say both Scrubbs are pretty versatile, high end defenders, all super high IQ players. And I think, if you can kind of find room for some of those guys, it's also a really strong message to, the pool of players who, fly halfway around the world to go play in Chile, and then back right in the space of a weekend, that their efforts are rewarded, where the chance comes. So we'll see. It's going to be pretty fascinating. That roster construction is going to be crazy.
It's in the past because when I was a teenager, I had 2 summers that I spent playing a tournament and then an ID camp at Gonzaga. And Team Canada with like Pangos, Sacre, Olenek, Wiltshire, it was like a way to keep up with those guys' careers who I had met while I was down there. And now the team, I didn't meet Nemhard, but he's also Gonzaga Canadian, right? And now it's like the depth has gotten, it used to just be that it was like the Gonzaga guys were on Team Canada, but now the depth has gotten so good that a lot of I guess a lot of those guys are West Coast, but a lot of the, guys from Ontario, Toronto, man, the team is so deep, and and it also has the top end talent too. So yeah, it should be really exciting. My fingers are crossed. We
I
gotta,
think everyone's are, right. Like, I mean, I
yeah,
think I just know, some of the players and their families over the years, and I also have come to know like the people within the organization have really just been trying to lift this thing over the finish line and made huge investments of time, effort, money, by the standards of what's available to them to try and make it first class. And the only thing missing is that signature moment that in turn would hopefully, unlock maybe a decade of them, right?
yeah.
And I think, I just think that that's the basketball, as far as basketball's come in, the years I've been covering it. that is kind of the one little missing piece to really kind of, put the sport on an equal footing with anything else that's offered in the country, right? Like I think the Raptors win and their success the past decade has been a huge thing. I
Hmm.
think the infrastructure, I always say, like the most important thing that's ever happened to basketball in Canada was a bunch of guys my age growing up playing and having no infrastructure whatsoever, becoming parents and saying, "Screw this! We're gonna start our own AAU team. We're gonna start our own league. We're gonna start offering camps." And and that's really been to me was by far the number one reason that guys like the RJ Barretts of the world kind of had a platform to leap off from. Um, but the finishing touch would be a national team, and we've seen it a little bit on the women's side, but on the men's side, just do something that nobody could ignore, and
Hmm.
it would be something epic at a world championship, or even, of course, more at the Olympics, and it'd be fun. It'd be a really cool thing.
Man, when I grew up in a town of 700 people, and growing up, but until I was probably about 15, there were the principals, Mr. Cameron. His house had a basketball hoop. My house had a basketball hoop that my mom put there because she played basketball, but my dad didn't. My dad had to coach so that I could have a team to play on in grade 12, so I could try and get like a scholarship to go play basketball somewhere. It was just like, but when I returned there this summer and I was doing carpentry work, there was like, it must have been like 40. There was only two basketball nets in the whole town, but now there's like 40. And so I can't imagine in that little town seeing it grow over the past 10 years, 12, seeing it. It just has to be way bigger across like the whole country too. It's very cool.
It's very cool. I mean, you're younger than me, but you've experienced it in your own time frame, and I won't bore you with what it maybe used to be like. But um, the what I'm really intrigued by is I remember when interviewing a bunch of guys on Team Canada. So it was Kelly, Corey, Tristan, um, you know, Andy Routens, that era.
Hmm.
And every one of them knew exactly where they were, like who they were with, what they were eating, um, you know, the whole scene when Vince Carter won the dunk contest in 2000. Like it was like, so they were all between 8 and 12 years old
Hmm.
when it happened. And, fast forward 8, 9, 10, 12 years, they were kind of a product of that in a way. And, so what I'm really fascinated by is kids who were 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 in 2019.
Yeah.
So we're talking, they're starting to filter up, right? Like,
Yeah.
we're going to start seeing them soon. Is, so 2028, 2029, 2030, 31. I would predict
Hmm.
they're going to be huge years for Canada across the landscape in terms of the draft and college and whatever other platforms kids are aspiring to then.
Yeah.
And, so I think these kind of moments, they do kind of create bursts of imagination that sustain people where there's maybe already some interest or opens their eyes to what could be a
Yeah.
passion. And we've seen it at different stages, but I think this would be the biggest one yet, no doubt. And a Canadian team, a national team, a men's national team, getting it done internationally would be another huge moment like that.
Touchstone moments, man. They create these big ripple effects. Michael, thank you for coming on the podcast. Is there anything you want to say to the listeners, the viewers, before we get out of here?
No, not at all. Just Samson, you do amazing work. It's your commitment's really impressive, and it's fun to come on and talk basketball, and I'm sure we'll be doing more of it soon.
Hell yeah. And thank you. That's like incredibly kind to say. Listeners, I don't really typically have to plug the person and say, but if you're watching basketball in Canada, you know who Michael Grange is, you're familiar with his work. Michael, thank you for coming on. Listener, thank you for listening in. And whether you got into this in the morning or at night, have a blessed day and goodbye.